The chamber had been designed by a species that believed architecture should settle political questions before anyone spoke. That was obvious the moment you walked into it. The ceiling climbed so high that the upper reaches vanished into a manufactured dusk where the light never quite reached and the eye never quite stopped trying to. The walls were cut from a pale mineral hauled in from the dead side of a moon whose orbit had decayed 2,000 years earlier. The floor was black enough to reflect every delegate back at themselves in stretched, wavering shadows. 52 species could sit in the chamber at once, each in a seat precisely shaped for their anatomy, each with a perfect view of the speaking dais at the center. No one could hide here. That, too, was part of the design. Ambassador Miriam Vale walked to the dais and felt absolutely nothing about the room. She was 53 years old. Her hair had gone silver early and she had never bothered to dye it back into a younger lie. She wore Earth's diplomatic gray, plain cut, no medals, no silk trim, no ornamental threads, no jeweled collar denoting committee seniority. The only mark on her was the Earth seal pinned at the throat of her jacket, small enough that most species in the upper tiers had to squint to see it. She set a stack of printed papers on the dais. Actual papers. Bound. Numbered. A few delegates noticed. One of the Orini on the 5th tier tilted its translucent head in visible amusement. A Kesh archivist in the left arc actually leaned forward with interest. Physical records struck half the chamber as archaic and the other half as theatrical. Vale knew that. It was one of many reasons she had brought them. She rested her fingertips on the top page and began to read. Her voice was not cold. Cold implied feeling with the heat removed. Her voice was flatter than that, the voice of a person delivering measurements, tonnage, body counts, transit delays, distances between one star and the next. The kind of voice acquired only after enough years in enough rooms where showing strain encouraged the wrong people. Earth submits the following to the assembly record, she said. The translation lattice scattered her words into 51 other languages. In the 11-month period beginning on the 3rd of heliocycle, there have been 14 confirmed incursions across the Naxos demarcation line into territory recognized under Charter Accord 12 as protected Earth frontier space. Of those 14 incursions, 5 resulted in interdiction of civilian supply traffic. 2 resulted in permanent loss of convoy assets. 1 resulted in the destruction of an inhabited station. She turned the page. The sound of paper moving was small in the vast chamber. It carried anyway. The Naxos demarcation line was established as a neutral corridor 40 light-years in depth between the Arcturan Protectorate and the Earth Outer Settlement Ring. It was ratified by this assembly 7 years ago. Earth has remained in compliance with all transit, armament, and inspection requirements specified under the Accord. The Protectorate has not. A soft shift moved through the Arcturan delegation. Their senior counselor, a tall being named Selvero, did not rise yet. He simply folded one long hand over the other and watched her from across the chamber with a patient expression his species wore when they intended to let lesser people embarrass themselves in full. Vale kept reading. On the 19th day of Ember Cycle, Convoy Red Lantern departed Port Solace carrying atmosphere processors, medical compounds, agricultural substrate, and replacement fusion regulators intended for settlements in the Kepri Verge. Convoy Red Lantern was intercepted 2.3 light-years inside recognized Earth protection space. 3 civilian freighters were boarded. 1 escort corvette was disabled. 28 personnel remain missing. Another page. On the 6th day of Frost Cycle, Station Carina Gate 9 ceased transmission. Carina Gate 9 was a permanently inhabited refueling, customs, and emergency refuge installation operating under assembly-recognized neutral access designation. At the time of signal loss, the station held 186 registered personnel, including 32 non-human contractors and 12 dependents. Search craft reached the coordinates 20 hours later. No station was present. No escape traffic was recorded. No debris field consistent with accidental reactor failure was found. 186 individuals remain unaccounted for. This time the chamber did react. Not loudly. Important rooms rarely reacted loudly. But there was movement. A low ripple in the tiers. A Vesk legal delegate murmuring to an aide. Two minor trade blocks turning toward each other with exactly the same expression. A watcher from the neutral press chorus pausing mid-note. Vale turned another page. Earth has filed 14 formal protests concerning violations of the Naxos corridor in the 11-month period under review. Earth has received 14 acknowledgments of receipt for notices of pending review and 1 expression of procedural sympathy from the Assembly Conflict Office. No finding has been issued. No enforcement action has been taken. No clarification regarding the disappearance of Karina Gate 9 has been provided. She did look up then. Not for drama. Because the next line did not require the paper. The chamber had been built to make species feel small. Miriam Vale stood at the center of it and let the silence collect for the exact length of one breath. Earth has reached the threshold of unilateral response, she said. Now Vero rose. He unfolded upward from his seat with slow ceremonial grace, all polished dark robes and controlled disapproval. He was old, which in Arcturan terms meant he had spent most of a century learning how to make dismissiveness sound like wisdom. Light moved strangely across the silver bands embedded beneath his skin, making him look almost haloed from a distance. Ambassador Vale, he said before the chamber could settle. I must object to the framing. You may object in your turn, Vale said. Nothing in her tone changed. That was what made the interruption land. Vero stopped. The chamber stopped with him. Vale placed one hand on the last page of her printed statement. Her thumb covered a block of text at the bottom that no one in the room had read yet and almost no one would think to request afterward. If any vessel, station, proxy fleet, corporate auxiliary, or contracted force operating under Arcturan authority crosses the Naxos line again, she said, Earth will act. No one moved. The translation lattice repeated it into 51 languages. Vale continued. Earth will not file an additional protest. Earth will not request emergency review. Earth will not seek mediation, delay, arbitration, clarification, or provisional restraint. Earth will act without further notice and without further communication. Now the silence changed. Before it had been procedural. Now it was something else. A few delegates shifted. The press chorus representative began writing again, much faster than before. Somewhere in the upper right tier, a quiet species from the periphery named the Tallarans simply stared at the sealed packet in Vale's hands with sudden, sharpened attention. Miriam Vale gathered the papers, aligned their edges once against the dais, and stepped back. That concludes Earth's formal statement, she said. Full documentation has been entered into the assembly record. She left the dais before anyone could pretend they had mistaken her tone for rhetoric. Behind her, Vero was already moving toward the response podium wearing the expression of a man about to explain proportionality to the weather. At the side access corridor, Vale's young aide, Tomas Ilian, fell into step beside her. They'll send it to review, he said quietly. Yes. 90 days. If they're feeling urgent. They walked beneath the pale arch of the exit corridor. Assembly light, soft and neutral and designed not to offend 52 species at once, painted everything into the same bloodless shade. Tomas hesitated. Do you think they understood what you meant? Vale reached into her sleeve, drew out a slim comm unit, and keyed a short encrypted burst with one thumb. 7 characters. Then she put the comm away. The statement, she said, was not for understanding. Tomas looked at her. Then what was it for? She did not slow. For the record, she said. And far beyond the assembly station, 3 days inside Earth-controlled space, a fleet commander's comm chimed once. Coordinator Nerol Thies of the press chorus did not leave when the chamber emptied. Most did. That was the way these sessions usually went. Delegates gathered their notes, fed reactions into aid networks, composed the first polished versions of what they had already decided to think, and moved on to the next room where another species was filing another grievance in another tone that would sound urgent for a few hours and become procedural by the next cycle. The high chamber dimmed by degrees as the assembly shifted into its evening rhythm. The upper shadows thickened. The black floor reflected fewer bodies. The pale walls lost their false warmth and became what they always were underneath the diplomatic design. Stone shaped into pressure. Nerral stayed in his seat in the fourth tier, second row from the left. The press chorus did not vote. It did not intervene. It did not carry fleets or legal authority or sanctions. It watched. It recorded. It noticed. Most major powers regarded that as a decorative function right up until a record became inconvenient, and they remembered too late that inconvenient things stayed inconvenient longer when someone patient had written them down first. Nerral opened Earth's submitted packet on his tablet and began reading from the top. Page 1 was exactly what Ambassador Vale had said aloud. Dates. Coordinates. Convoy designations. Protest numbers. Routing corridors. Standardized evidence references. It was put together cleanly. Not theatrically clean. Not the kind of polished document designed to impress the room. It looked like the work of a person who expected hostile readers and had built the file so that no one could pry a finger width of ambiguity out of it. Page 2. Page 3. Page 4. He read in the same methodical way he did everything else, eyes moving steadily, making no assumptions until the line in front of him required one. He had held this role for 26 years. Long enough to know that dramatic claims were rarely where the danger lived. Danger preferred footnotes, appendices, dates, consistency between filings years apart, odd wording in otherwise dry records. Danger liked to sit in places important people skipped because important people believed their instincts were a substitute for careful reading. By the time the chamber lights shifted into full low cycle, Nerral was on page 10. He turned to page 11. He stopped. Not visibly. Not in any way another species would have noticed from across the chamber. The press chorus trained its people out of visible reactions for the same reason militaries did. But internally, something reached up and took hold of his thinking. Page 11 was not an argument. That was the first thing. It was not language intended to persuade the assembly, or shame it, or force it into courage it had not displayed thus far. There was no accusation in it beyond the accusation implied by structure. No rhetorical heat. No adjectives. No moral framing. It was a list. He read the title twice. Regional Asset Index. Arcturan Protectorate Operational Infrastructure within 40 light-years of the Naxos Demarcation Corridor. Below the title ran 73 entries. Each had a category marker. Each had coordinates. Each had a support function designation. Each had a sequence number. Fuel depot. Signal tower. Drive. Transit gate. Patrol anchor. Auxiliary logistics ring. Carrier support cradle. 73 entries. Ordered. Numbered. Sequenced. Nerral sat very still and read the list a second time. He knew what posturing looked like. Entire careers inside the assembly were built on posturing. Species threatened each other with economic review, with formal censure, with symbolic suspensions, with coalition language and security consultations and every other elegant instrument civilizations developed when they preferred the appearance of motion to the consequences of it. This was not that. A bluff wanted to be seen. A targeting architecture wanted to be usable. At the bottom of the page, beneath the 73rd entry, beneath the document verification marks and filing cipher and Earth diplomatic seal, there was a date. He looked at that date longer than he had looked at anything else in the file. 3 years, 11 months, and 6 days before today. He checked the timeline from page 1. Then he checked it again. The first recorded Arcturan incursion into the Naxos corridor, the one the assembly had processed as an unfortunate but non-actionable navigational ambiguity, had occurred exactly 4 days before the date at the bottom of page 11. Nerral leaned back in his seat. Around him the chamber continued doing what chambers did after important moments. Staff drones skimmed the aisles collecting abandoned translation slates. 2 legal aides from the mid-rim trade sphere were speaking in low tones near the side ramp about whether Earth's phrase threshold of unilateral response constituted pre-hostility language under Article 9. Selvero's delegation had already withdrawn behind privacy fields in their assigned consultation arc. The room, in every visible way, was returning to normal. Nerral looked back at the date. 4 days after the first incursion, someone on Earth had opened a file and started a numbered sequence. Not after station losses. Not after convoy disappearances. Not after a year of escalation. After the first one. He imagined, for one unhelpful moment, what that meant in live time. A complaint filed. A complaint acknowledged. Some clerk marking it as being under provisional review. Some counselor somewhere deciding it was too small to provoke direct censure. Some committee timetable being generated because timetables always were. And 4 days later, on another world, under another government, a human official had decided not to trust the system enough to wait for a second data point. The thought landed hard. Not because it suggested human aggression. Because it suggested human conclusion. Nerral zoomed in on the sequence field beside entries 1 through 10. They were not arranged by size. Not by symbolic value. Not even by obvious military priority if one assumed the point of a retaliatory strike was spectacle. They were arranged by connective logic. Entry 1 was a communications relay feeding 6 regional border nodes. Entry 2 was a transit routing spindle serving patrol response traffic. Entry 3 was an orbital fuel reserve that supported long-range interdiction runs. Entry 4 was a dry dock whose only relevance, on first glance, was maintenance. On second glance, its only relevance became obvious. Without it, 3 of the nearby escort classes could not cycle hull stress repairs fast enough to sustain a prolonged border posture. Nerral exhaled once through his nose. The 73 entries were not a revenge list. They were a dismantling pattern. He opened a message window addressed to Deputy Auditor Kes Mar of the Quiet Ledger, one of the few people in the station's oversight network who read faster than rumor moved and understood numbers before politics translated them into safety. He began typing. Read Earth's full filing immediately. Do not rely on chamber summaries. Page 11 is not rhetorical material. It appears to be an operational strike sequence built across approximately 4 years. Earliest preparation date is 4 days after first recorded corridor incursion. Recommending immediate cross-comparison with Arcturan infrastructure maps and traffic dependencies. This may not be a threat display. This may be precompiled execution logic. He stopped with his fingers above the screen. That was not enough. He deleted the final line and wrote a different one. If anyone with actual authority can still interrupt this, they need to understand that the warning spoken aloud is not the important part. The list is. He sent it. The message left his tablet and vanished into station routing. He did not feel better. He read page 11 again. Across the chamber, Earth's seat remained empty now, its small seal visible on the backrest under the low light. There was dust beginning to settle on the upper edge, a thin, almost invisible line of neglect that had not existed when Ambassador Vale took the podium an hour earlier. Nerral looked from the empty seat to the date at the bottom of the list and then to entry 1. Then, because careful readers survived by distrusting coincidence, he opened traffic reports for the Naxos corridor covering the previous 3 weeks. He did not know what he was looking for yet, only that if Earth had spent 4 years preparing a sequence, there was a very real possibility that what the chamber had heard today was not the beginning of anything. Only the last thing Earth had been willing to say before beginning. Commander Elias Vorn was reviewing maintenance deferrals when the signal arrived. Not battle plans. Not threat briefings. Maintenance deferrals. The file open on his desk concerned a carrier in the 6th Outer Readiness Group whose portside launch rails had developed a heat warp issue under sustained cycling. The engineering team wanted another 11 days in dry dock. The operations office wanted the ship released in 6. Vorn had the report in one hand and a cup of coffee gone cold in the other when his private comm gave a single quiet pulse. No alert tone. No flashing priority stripe. Just one pulse. He set the coffee down, read the 7-character burst on the screen, and said nothing at all. Outside his office viewport, Titan Yard Ring 4 turned in silent geometry around Earth's upper orbit, vast arcs of unfinished hulls and docking arms and fuel spines drifting against the blue curve of the planet below. It was morning over the Atlantic. Sunlight was sliding over the atmosphere in a clean white band. Somewhere beneath that band, people were going to work, walking children to school, standing in kitchen light with half-drunk tea, doing the small ordinary things that made up most of a civilization's life. Vorn looked back at the 7 characters. That was all Ambassador Vale had sent. That was enough that he placed the maintenance file flat on the desk, signed the bottom line approving the 6-day release schedule, and pushed the document into the completed stack. Then he opened the secure drawer built into the desk and removed a slim black data wafer with no external label. He inserted it into the desk reader. The file that appeared had no formal title. In system directories, it lived under a logistics designation so dull most auditors ignored it after the first line. Fuel network resilience modeling. Supply corridor contingency distribution. Something like that. Harmless language. Necessary language. The language of a system built by people who understood that the easiest way to hide something important was to let it look like work no one wanted to read. Vorn opened the index. 73 entries. Every one of them cleanly updated. He read through the first section not because he needed to remember it, but because reading was part of the discipline. It forced the mind to move in order. Order mattered now. Relay chain severance. Transit isolation. Regional command blindness. Patrol desynchronization. Fuel starvation. Docking paralysis. Asset immobilization. He closed the file. Then he opened a fleet-wide coordination channel marked for 12 recipients only. The 12 appeared one by one, each in a small window above his desk surface. Some were in offices. One stood halfway through a dry dock inspection with sparks flashing somewhere behind her shoulder. Another was on a moving tram between orbital rings. A third appeared from what looked like the corner of a medical review boardroom, his expression already flattened into the stillness of immediate attention. No one asked why they had been called. The fact of the channel was the explanation. Vorn looked at all 12 of them once, making sure each connection had stabilized. "The clock has started," he said. That was all. Not because there was nothing more to say. Because they had already spent years saying the rest in every form that mattered. Fuel charts, readiness drills, staffing models, munitions projections, maintenance forecasts, quiet route simulations nested inside shipping algorithms, and emergency transit exercises mislabeled as customs burden tests. A civilization did not arrive prepared by holding one dramatic meeting. It arrived prepared by doing the same unglamorous work correctly for a long enough time that the work itself became momentum. Coordinator Lin from Ring 2 nodded once. "Final readiness confirmation?" 48 hours, Vorn said. "After that I don't want deficiency reports. I want resolutions." 12 acknowledgements came back. Again, no one asked what had happened in the assembly chamber. No one asked whether the committee had voted or whether the Arcturines had apologized or whether there might still be time for mediation. People ask those questions when they think the shape of a situation is still changing. This shape had been understood for 4 years. Vorn ended the channel. For a moment the office was quiet except for the yard noise bleeding faintly through the insulated walls, the deep metallic thump of mag clamps locking, the faraway shiver of hull plates under stress testing, the almost musical sequence of proximity tones from docking arms moving through pre-programmed arcs. He stood, picked up the cold coffee, drank it anyway, and walked out into the ring. Titan yards smelled like hot metal, coolant vapor, and sealant curing under work lights. Vorn had always liked shipyards. Not because they were beautiful. Beauty was irrelevant to their purpose. He liked them because everything in them existed to become ready. Nothing preened. Nothing argued about optics. Things were either fit for use or they were not, and the work of the place was moving them from one state to the other. His aide, Lieutenant Mara Say, fell in behind him halfway down the inspection spine with a tablet already in hand. She had worked under him for 11 months and had learned the same lesson most competent aides eventually learned around competent commanders. If the commander began walking without explanation, the explanation was already over. "Commander, get me updated fuel and munitions status on all 12 line groups." "Yes, sir." "Not summaries. I want actual numbers." "Yes, sir." "And patch the casualty projection models through the latest colonial population tables. All outer settlement data. No old census baselines." Mara glanced down at her tablet. Her fingers moved. "Done." He did not look at her when he asked the next question. "Civilian lane traffic." She understood enough by now not to ask why that mattered right this second. Commercial reduction protocols can be initiated through transportation without military flagging. Quietly, it'll take 18 hours? She blinked, then checked. 17 if they don't argue. They'll argue. Yes, sir. Give them 15. He kept walking. They reached Hull 9, a long-range carrier hanging in skeletal cradle braces above the inner arc of the ring. Yard crews moved across its surface in disciplined swarms, welding, sealing, calibrating, checking readouts that glowed blue against the black of the hull. From this angle the ship looked asleep. Vorn knew better. Readiness always looked like stillness from outside. Mara's voice came at his shoulder, more careful now. Commander, should I amend the standing timeline? Vorn stopped beneath the carrier and looked up at the dark mass of it. For 4 years he had thought about this fleet in parts. Not in the grand false way politicians talked about fleets, as symbols or leverage or messages. He had thought about bearings, fuel ratios, redundancy trees, crew rotations, replacement parts, surgical inventory placement, transit compression, medevac windows, cold storage capacity, how many people could be hurt before a sequence broke, how many ships could be lost before another route had to absorb the task. Planning, properly done, was not imagination. It was a refusal to be surprised by the work. Yes, he said. Mara waited. Move everything forward. She made the note. Far above the ring, the earth hung blue and unaware under the morning sun. Behind them, in a chamber designed to make species feel small, procedure would already be setting itself in motion, votes and acknowledgments and formal review clocks beginning their smooth patient turn. Vorn looked once more at Hull 9. Then at the next carrier beyond it. And the next. And the next. 12 in this ring alone. Ready or nearly ready. Fueled or in final load. Waiting not for a decision, but for the moment words became unnecessary. The statement wasn't for them, he said, mostly to himself. Mar did not ask who he meant. He turned away from the hull and kept walking. The second station went dark on a Tuesday. Not that Tuesday meant anything at the edge of the Naxos corridor except to humans and the calendars they insisted on carrying into places where time had long ago stopped feeling domestic. Sergeant Jonah Mercer knew it was Tuesday because he kept a paper calendar pinned above his bunk and because he had torn off the right number of pages that morning before shift change. The picture for this month was Marseille Harbor at dawn. He had never been to Marseille Harbor at dawn. He had been born there, but memory and photographs were different species of truth, and the truth on the paper was orange light on water and quiet cranes against morning sky. He was 3 days out from Earth aboard the freight escort hauler Meridian Glass when the comm board in cargo security changed one tiny light from green to gray. No alarm followed. That was the worst part. If alarms sounded, the body knew what to do with them. Heart rate went up. Hands got steady or shaky depending on training. Mouth went dry. Adrenaline had a use. But gray lights were for absences. For missing things. For systems that should have been speaking and were not. The communications officer ran the handshake twice. Then a third time. Then a fourth, because disbelief likes repetition when it thinks repetition might alter the answer. Karina Gate 12, she said eventually, very flat. No signal. Mercer looked up from the inventory slate in his hands. Karina Gate 12 was not his assignment. It was not his station. He had no personal connection to it that he knew of. But he knew what a corridor station meant at this distance from home. It meant air, fuel, emergency berth, warm food if you were lucky and the cook still cared. It meant somewhere frightened civilians could dock if their engines started coughing radiation into vacuum. It meant people whose names you did not know making the empty places survivable by standing their shifts on time. The captain's voice came over the internal channel a minute later. Controlled. The voice of a person arranging language while speaking it. Karina Gate 12 has ceased responding. We are rerouting to Sagan Depot by emergency corridor. All security personnel remain at readiness. Further updates to follow. Mercer set the inventory slate down. Picked it back up. Looked at the same line item for maybe 30 seconds without reading any of it. Across from him, Corporal Day Kim stared at the gray light on the comm board and said, very quietly, not again. Nobody answered. 22 minutes later the update came. Not from Carina Gate 12. From a Protectorate navigation buoy that had appeared exactly at the station's last registered coordinates and was now broadcasting in cheerful standard assembly format on all civilian bands. Transit lane correction in progress. Commercial traffic, please divert to alternate corridor. Thank you for your cooperation. Mercer read the text once over the comm officer's shoulder. Then again. It took his mind a moment to catch up to what his eyes already understood. Not because the message was complicated. Because it was too simple. Too clean. There had been a station there. 193 personnel, if memory served, because he had processed a temporary rotation manifest through 12 8 months ago and remembered noticing that the station's posted staffing level was slightly high for a node its size. 193 people. Now there was a buoy thanking travelers for their patience. God, Kim said, still very quietly. Mercer went back to his bunk space because there was nowhere else to go that made more sense. He sat down. Looked at Marseille Harbor at dawn. Looked away from it. Picked up the inventory slate again because his hands needed a task, and tasks, even useless ones, gave the body a structure to stand inside. He read line item 1. He moved to line item 2. He got through 6 entries before the numbers stopped being inventory and started turning themselves into other numbers entirely. 186 on Carina Gate 9. 193 on Carina Gate 12. 379 people. He said the number out loud without meaning to. Kim, passing his bunk on the way back from the comm station, paused. What? Mercer looked at the slate. Not at her. 379, he said. 9 and 12 together. She stood there for a second, then nodded once in that way soldiers did when there was nothing useful to offer but a witness to the fact that something had just become heavier. Back on assembly station, the condolences were delivered within 72 hours. Councillor Vero spoke them personally, which several delegations later referred to as a significant gesture. He expressed profound regret regarding the regrettable loss of continuity at Carina Gate 12. He described the Protectorate's concern as sincere and ongoing. He assured the chamber that a full investigatory committee would be merged with the existing Naxos review panel for efficiency of process. He did not mention the buoy. He did not mention 193. He used the phrase navigational stabilization event. Earth's seat in the chamber was empty. It had been empty for 4 days by then. The administrative notice had been brief and precise. Earth's diplomatic representation was temporarily suspended pending internal review. No timeline. No elaboration. No request for special accommodation. The chair sat in the third row with the little Earth seal still visible on its back, and a fine line of station dust had begun gathering along the upper edge where no one's hand had brushed it away. Coordinator Neralthis looked at that empty chair for a long time while the committee extension was approved from 90 days to 120. Then he looked down at page 11 on his tablet. At the sequence list. At the date 4 days after the first incursion. At entry 19, which corresponded to the buoy now singing over the coordinates where Carina Gate 9 had once existed. His mouth went dry. He began writing another message. This one shorter. This one stripped of all the careful framing that had failed to move anyone the first time. Second station lost. Earth seat abandoned. Commercial lane traffic declining toward 0. Sequence list still aligns with Protectorate infrastructure. This is no longer speculative. If intervention remains possible, it is not diplomatic. Act as though the timing window has already begun. He sent it. Then he sat in the chamber while the process processed. Far from the station, far from the chamber, far from every voice discussing timelines and committee structure and interspecies legal norms, Commander Elias Vorn stood alone in the observation gallery above Titan Yard Ring 4 and watched 6 carriers begin silent fueling operations under blackout discipline. Nothing dramatic happened. No sirens. No speeches. No fleet-wide alert. Just docking arms moving into place with practiced precision and vast dark hulls drinking in the kind of fuel load used only when ships were not planning to stay near home. Vorn watched for a while. Then he turned away from the glass and went back to work. 14 days after Carina Gate 12 went dark, the assembly finally noticed that Earth was no longer answering. Not immediately. Nothing in large institutions happens immediately unless it has already been decided somewhere else. The first missed response was logged as a probable scheduling conflict. The second as a temporary diplomatic withdrawal consistent with species-specific grievance behavior. The third triggered a low-tier communications review because low-tier reviews were what systems produced when they needed to prove they had taken note of a thing without yet admitting the thing mattered. The communications office ran the channel checks in orderly sequence. Primary diplomatic band. Secondary emergency band. Commercial relay overlay. Text-only legal protocol transmission. The old courier handshake route nobody used unless they wanted to be very formal or very annoying. Every channel opened cleanly. Every signal reached Earth's registered reception net. Every line remained empty. No static. No refusal. No auto-response. No polite note from an exhausted attaché explaining that the delegation would re-engage after internal consultation. Just the particular sound of a functioning line with no one on the other end. In the Legal Review Office, this became a notation. In the Interspecies Relations Office, it became an inquiry draft. In Salvero's morning briefing, it became something charming. Humans withdraw when they feel unheard, he said, stirring tea with one long silver utensil in the small, precise movements of a man who had never once in his life been forced to rush his own breakfast. It is theatrical, but not uncommon. Give them a week. His aide made a note because aides always made notes when senior counselors reduced a development to something smaller than it was. It gave the reduction somewhere official to live. Coordinator Neralthis received the same update through a different channel and sat very still for so long that his tea went cold beside his hand. Then he opened the shipping lane reports. The first thing he checked was the Naxos outer commercial corridor. Normally it moved thousands of civilian and freight beacons across any 10-day window, enough signal density that analysts complained about filtering noise. Over the last 16 days the count had not merely dropped. It had gone to zero. Not reduced. Not disrupted. Not intermittent. Zero. He checked the inner colony lanes next, the ones between Earth's settlement ring and the transit infrastructure feeding the assembly corridor. Those lanes should have been cluttered with tankers, haulers, private carriers, passenger movements, maintenance tugs, prospecting returns, relief craft, inspection vessels. Civilizations made noise simply by continuing to exist. Even unhappy civilizations did. Particularly unhappy ones. Earth's lanes showed absence with the smooth, clean edges of intent. No freight. No civilian traffic. No beacon clutter. No routine logistics chatter. No orbital queue congestion. Neral stared at the graph. Then he pulled a second report, this one from automated sensor stations along the farther edge of Earth's recognized sphere. The data was unprocessed, which was usually another way of saying ignored. He ran a retrospective filter across the last 21 days and waited while the station systems did the work. The answer came back in 5 separate windows. 17 days earlier, a large-scale traffic movement had crossed the buffer region. 12 days earlier, fuel draw anomalies had been detected at 6 orbital rings. 11 days earlier, commercial signatures had begun collapsing toward nothing. 9 days earlier, deep-range monitors had logged convoy shadows so large the system had initially merged them into background mass. 7 days earlier, every major civilian route out of Earth space had already gone empty. Earth had not gone quiet. Earth had gone clear. There is a difference. Quiet is what a person does when they are still in the room but have chosen not to speak. Clear is what a room becomes after everyone who is not essential has already left it. Neral opened a long-range sweep request and flagged it over the heads of 3 different offices simultaneously. Then he opened every recent border report he could access from the Protectorate side of the Naxos line. One of them had already used the word significant. It was filed by Patrol Commander Ilya Saran of the Protectorate vessel Glass Meridian, a narrow-hulled border cutter that had spent 9 years doing the same route and had therefore acquired the dangerous habit all long-serving patrol crews eventually acquire, assuming tomorrow's strangeness will be small enough to fit yesterday's language. Saran had made her first report 16 hours earlier. Anomalous contact. Drive signatures layered or overlapping. Possible sensor bloom. Recommend calibration verification. Nerl read the report once and then opened the attached raw feed. The first pass looked like an error. A smear at the edge of long-range detection. An object too large to be one ship and too coherent to be interference. The second pass looked worse. The third did not look like anything the monitoring software had categories for at all. The software kept trying to interpret the contact as a cluster of standard hull classes moving in close formation. Then the cluster kept expanding as the data resolved, each apparent ship becoming several, each several becoming dozens, each dozen becoming something that no border patrol vessel should ever have to be the first to count. He opened Saran's second report. Manual count suspended at 41. Estimate rising. Contact maintains steady heading. No evidence of concealment behavior. No evidence of concealment behavior. That line mattered. Whoever was moving across the dark beyond the Naxos line was not sneaking, not jamming, not scattering signatures to confuse pursuit. They were moving with the even, unhurried pace of something that had already chosen its destination and no longer needed uncertainty for protection. Nerl looked from the report to page 11. Then back. Entry 1. Entry 2. Entry 3. The list had not been a threat index. It had been an itinerary. He reached for his cold tea, stopped, left it untouched, and began making calls. By the time his first call found someone with enough rank to authorize a full emergency sweep, Patrol Commander Saran had already filed a third report. This one had skipped her immediate superior entirely and gone straight to regional command. The language had changed. Not because she had become more emotional. Because emotion had ceased to be useful. Formation size exceeds prior estimates. Contact resolution ongoing. Multiple drive classes present. Recommend immediate strategic notification. Repeating, immediate. On Earth, in the Secure Operations Wing buried 3 decks below the main command spine of the carrier Resolute Vector, Commander Elias Vorn stood in front of a tactical wall showing 12 carrier groups spread across a volume of space so large the mind resisted converting it into anything intuitive. Nothing on the display blinked red. Nothing on it suggested alarm. Every formation marker moved exactly where it was supposed to move, at exactly the speed the schedule required. Lieutenant Mara Say stood beside him with the updated lane clearing report in hand. Civilian corridors are empty, she said. I know. Final freight confirmations completed 12 hours ago. I know. She hesitated, then asked the only question left that was not already buried inside the answer. Do you want the diplomatic channels closed entirely? Vorn considered it. No, he said. Leave them open. Mara glanced at him. He did not explain at first. Then, because good aides deserve complete orders, he added, an empty line says something different than a dead one. She entered the notation. Behind them, operations staff moved through the control room in low-voiced precision, checking route compression windows, fuel transfer completion, medbay redundancy, casualty projection overlays, sequence timing alignment. Nobody rushed. Rushing was what you did when time surprised you. This had not surprised anyone in the room. Vorn looked at the tactical wall. 73 entries. 12 carrier groups. Years of preparation converted now into distances, fuel loads, staffing matrices, and approach vectors. He thought about Ambassador Vale in the assembly chamber reading the warning into the record with that level voice of hers. He thought about the 7-character burst. He thought about the difference between telling someone what would happen and beginning the thing itself. Then he said, advance all groups to final pre-crossing posture. The room acknowledged as one organism. Out beyond the last civilian route markers, beyond the buffers and accords and legal fictions that had for years pretended the line meant the same thing to everyone who cited it, the fleet moved. Steady. Even. Unhurried. Not the movement of something trying to avoid being seen. The movement of something that had already finished deciding. The fleet crossed the Naxos line at 0312 fleet time. There were no alarms on the human side. Commander Elias Vorn had disabled them 19 days earlier because there was no useful purpose in startling yourself with a fact you had already scheduled. On the tactical wall of the Resolute Vector, the demarcation boundary slid beneath the formation markers in a silent change of color, one thin blue line giving way to the muted gold of Protectorate-adjacent space. That was all. No one on the bridge stood up straighter. No one announced history. History was a thing other people named afterward. The people who did the work generally called it by its coordinates. Vorn sat at the command table with a cup of black coffee, a casualty projection window folded into the lower left corner of his display, and 73 sequence entries stacked in numbered order along the right side. Entry 1 was already expanded. Communication Relay Cluster N14. Regional designation Vardy's Outer Spine. Function, Border-to-Command traffic handoff for 6 remote stations and 2 patrol sectors. Sequence logic, sever first link, delay comprehension, thicken the fog before the larger shape is seen. Confirm all groups in final posture, he said. One by one, the responses came in. Group 1 confirmed. Group 2 confirmed. Escort lattice confirmed. Signal suppression screen confirmed. Medical chain confirmed. Recovery wing confirmed. Everything where it should be. Everything moving when it should move. Everything built, over 4 years, toward the simple utility of being exactly here at exactly this time with exactly this amount of force. Vorn looked once at entry 1. Execute, he said. Far ahead of the main formation in Protectorate patrol space, Commander Ilya Saran of the Glass Meridian was staring at a sensor picture that no longer fit the words she had available for it. At first it had been a bloom, then a formation, then something larger than formation, because formation implied a size the mind could still gather into one view. This no longer gathered. It kept resolving. The more her long-range systems understood, the less comforting the picture became. Drive signatures nested inside other drive signatures. Escort shadows spread in arcs beyond arcs. Tonnage estimates that climbed every time she ran them. She had stopped trusting the software and put 2 tactical analysts on manual count. They had stopped calling out numbers at 63 because 63 had ceased to be the interesting fact. The interesting fact was heading. The contact was not drifting. It was not testing. It was not lingering near the boundary in the elaborate almost violations that major powers used when they wanted to exert pressure without forcing anyone into formal response. It was coming through. Regional command acknowledging? She asked. Her communications officer checked and checked again with the flat, quick motions of someone trying not to let fear become visible in the hands. 4th transmission received. No instructions yet. No instructions yet. Saran looked at the sensor wall and thought, not for the first time in the last 20 minutes, about all the reports that had gone up the chain before hers. The first one politely cautious so no one could accuse her of overreaction. The second one urgent enough to skip a superior. The third one stripped down to facts so hard they almost cut. Significant contact. Rising estimates. No concealment behavior. Immediate strategic notification recommended. She had done everything right. The thing coming at her screen did not care. Open direct border net to Vardy's relay, she said. All 6 stations. Full emergency handoff. If command won't answer, the stations need to. The communications officer obeyed. For a heartbeat the net opened. For exactly that long, 6 border stations and 1 patrol vessel existed inside the same web of signal. Then relay N14 went dark. There was no bright flash on the board. No cinematic bloom. Just the ugly instantaneous absence of a thing that had been there 1 second and was no longer there the next. All 6 station channels stuttered, desynchronized, and collapsed into isolated point traffic. The uplink to regional command vanished with them. On the Glass Meridian Bridge, nobody spoke. The communications officer tried to rebuild the path automatically, then manually, then through a fallback routing tree that should have found some kind of degraded signal if the relay had suffered technical failure. Nothing. Saran looked at the dead space where N14 had been and felt the exact moment in which a border incident became something else. Record the time, she said. Her tactical officer looked up from his board. Commander! Record the time, she repeated. Regional relay cluster destroyed at 0312 local. Full blackout to border net sectors 1 through 6. The officer's hands moved. Saran opened a direct ship-to-ship alert toward the nearest patrol wing and got 3 acknowledgements back before the line degraded into static-edged silence. Whatever had taken the relay had not bothered to target her first. That was what chilled her most. Not that they could have. That they had not needed to. She was not the first problem on the board. She was an aftereffect. On the Resolute vector, Sequence 1 updated from pending to complete. A small change on a screen. A relay icon dimming to gray. A route map blossoming with the consequences of a missing node. Vorn watched the border sectors recalculate themselves into confusion. He did not smile. Satisfaction had nothing to do with it. The first target existed to make the next 10 easier to reach and the 10 after that possible to hold. It was engineering, not triumph. You removed load-bearing points in the order the structure required. Emotion made people inefficient around structures. Sequence 2, he said. A fuel reserve spindle serving long-range protectorate patrols across the outer arc of the corridor. Not glamorous. Not politically visible. The kind of asset no one gave speeches about and no border command could function without for more than 48 hours once it was gone. Execute. Beyond the patrol vessel and the dead relay cluster, one of the outer escort groups detached from the human formation with the clean vector shift of something following a pre-written line. Not racing. Not showing off. Just moving to the next coordinate because the previous coordinate was finished. On Saran's bridge, the tactical officer had gone pale beneath the blue cast of the screens. "Commander," he said quietly, "they're not massing on a station. They're skipping." "Skipping?" He swallowed. "They're moving by index." Saran looked at him. He pulled up the projected contact paths, overlaid them against local infrastructure, and for a second the shape became visible. Not random advance. Not broad invasion front. A sequence. A line of points already chosen. Saran thought of the reports from the assembly hearings. Of the human warning all the border feeds had summarized as diplomatic escalation behavior. Of the station disappearances. Of the committees she had half heard discussed over mess tables as though committees were weather and therefore not military business. Then she thought of the dead relay and the contact moving toward the next point in perfect calm. "Send to all remaining stations," she said. "No waiting for command. No waiting for confirmation. Human fleet has crossed. Repeat, human fleet has crossed. This is not a demonstration." Her communications officer transmitted. 3 stations answered. 2 did not. 1 came back with a burst of fragmented code, the kind systems spit out when their traffic is interrupted by physics. At 0341 fleet time, Sequence 2 went dark. Vorn took 1 sip of his coffee and moved the display to Sequence 3. Sergeant Jonah Mercer hit the platform at 0604 fleet time. Target designation was Sequence 8. Official name, Arcturan Maintenance and Transit Coordination Hub Demi 4. Operational function, docking control, escort turnaround, sensor calibration, corridor maintenance dispatch. Practical meaning, one of the places that kept the outer protectorate machine moving without anyone important ever having to think about it. Mercer had read the briefing packet 3 times during transit and then once more after the dropship latched to the hull because reading the packet gave his hands something to do besides turn the same thoughts over again. The packet was precise in the way all serious military documents were precise. Corridor maps. Pressure door placements. Security station locations. Reactor safeties. Civilian quarter distribution. Rules of engagement broken down into clauses and subclauses so that no one in his unit had to guess what counted as a lawful target and what did not. That, more than anything else, was what settled him. Not the weapons. Not the armor. Not the scale of the fleet moving around them in the dark. The rules. Someone had thought about this hard enough to leave as little room as possible for the wrong kind of improvisation. The dropship clamped. The bay light changed. Lieutenant Arya Solberg looked once along the bench of her squad and said, "Same as briefed. Fast, controlled, no drift. No speeches. No slogans. No attempt to make them feel larger than they were." Mercer appreciated that. The hatch blew inward and the squad moved. Demi 4's outer maintenance corridor was narrower than the schematics had suggested, One of those small differences that happened whenever you entered a real place instead of the version of it held in diagrams. The gravity was a little heavy, likely the product of an aging spin grid compensating unevenly across the station ring. The air smelled faintly metallic even through filter seals. Emergency strips were already flashing amber, which meant the station had understood by now that something was wrong, though not yet how wrong. Mercer took third position through the first pressure door. The first two defenders were where the packet said they would be, security post at the corner where Corridor A split toward operations and docking control. They were fast enough to make the contact real but not fast enough to overcome the fact that Earth had spent 4 years learning exactly where they would stand. Down, Solberg snapped. The first defender went for his sidearm and caught a shock round square in the chest plate. The second tried to get the blast shutter closed and took a kinetic dart through the shoulder joint. Both stayed alive. That mattered. Mercer registered it because he had registered every line in the ROE where the ROE made room for what came after. Disable when possible. Kill only under active lethal resistance. This was not mercy exactly. Mercy implied emotion. It was structure. Dead defenders turned into symbols. Living defenders turned into testimony. They cleared the post in 23 seconds and kept moving. At the third pressure door, one of the station's internal defenses woke up hard. A recessed ceiling turret the briefing packet had flagged as probable but unconfirmed. It came down halfway and began to track. Ceiling. Mercer dropped flat. The corridor filled with the crack of rapid-fire kinetic bursts so loud in the enclosed space that his teeth hummed with it. Specialist Ramon hit the turret housing with a breaching slug at an angle Mercer would not have thought possible under fire. The turret sheared off its own mount and slammed into the deck 2 feet from Mercer's boots, still spitting sparks. He looked up at it from the floor, breathing too fast. Then he got moving again because stopping in a live corridor was how names got added to boards later. They reached operations in 11 minutes. Not because they were heroes. Because they had the map. Because they knew which hull to ignore, which blast door was false reinforcement and which one actually mattered, where the security team would try to regroup, where the civilian quarter split began and therefore where not to throw anything explosive no matter how tempting speed became. Preparation was not courage. It just made courage less expensive. Mercer entered the operations floor behind Solberg and took in the room in a single sweep. Screens. Routing boards. Power flow diagrams. Workstations left active in the rush. A half-drunk cup of something green sitting beside a control console as though the person assigned to that console had expected to return in a minute. 3 station technicians on the floor with their hands visible and their faces showing the stunned, thin-blooded expression of people whose ordinary morning had ended faster than they could update it in their own heads. Operations secure, Solberg said into CommandNet. Sequence 8 achieved. Beginning control lock. Confirmation came back from above in a voice so calm it might have been ordering a cargo transfer. Copy. Hold for secondary. Mercer stood in the center of the room and breathed for a second. The adrenaline in him had nowhere obvious to go now that the immediate work was over. He checked his weapon. Checked the nearest doorway. Checked the status board on the wall even though he didn't fully understand half the Arcturan maintenance icons. Around him, his unit spread into the practiced pattern that meant a place had become theirs for the moment. Security at the doors. Restraints on the defenders. Tech specialist at the station board. Medic checking Kim, who had caught a ricochet fragment across the thigh seal but was still swearing steadily enough to suggest she would live. Mercer moved because movement gave the body direction. He walked the edge of the operations floor and through the side corridor into station quarters. Not for tactical necessity. For orientation. A senior soldier on site needed to know what site meant. That was all. Demi 4 had the same look all working installations had when stripped of insignia and species difference. Narrow bunks. Storage lockers. One personal item allowed visible at each berth. A photograph held under a clip strip. A polished shell from some ocean world. A tiny potted plant fighting for life under a utility lamp. A cracked reading slate. Ordinary things. The kind of things that made it harder, not easier, to turn a place into just another sequence number unless you were very careful about how you held the work in your mind. Mercer stopped at one bunk where a paper printout had been pinned above the sleeping shelf. Paper that caught his eye. A calendar page, old and wrinkled, showing some protectorate coastal city under red evening light. A date circled twice in blue ink for reasons he would never know. He stood there a moment longer than he should have. 379 people from 9 and 12. One circled date on a stranger's wall. A station on a list. A room with a plant under a lamp. The comm at his shoulder chirped. Mercer, Solberg's voice said, report back. Secondary just came through. He looked once more at the bunk. At the calendar. At the small ordinary shape of a life arranged around routine. Then he turned and went back toward operations because the next thing was waiting, and whatever else this was, whatever weight it would become later, right now it was still the next thing. The Directorate's first envoy arrived on the 4th day of the operation with the kind of confidence only institutions possessed. The vessel was called the Harmonious Intent, which was exactly the sort of name a diplomatic ship acquired when enough committees had touched the naming process to remove anything a living person might actually choose. It was large enough to be unmistakable, white-hulled, crest-marked, running full identification beacons on every frequency recognized under assembly law. It announced itself for 2 hours before reaching the holding perimeter, as though clarity itself might still be a kind of authority. It was met by 2 human escorts. Not warships in the grand theatrical sense. Not carriers. Not the blunt dark mass of the strike groups that had crossed the Naxos line. Just escorts. Lean, armored, practical vessels that slid into position off the envoy's port and starboard arcs with such perfect timing that the movement looked less like interception than geometry resolving. Their transponders identified them in standard form. Their weapons remained cold. Their signal officer opened a direct channel and introduced herself by name, rank, and authority. Her tone was courteous. That was what unsettled Envoy Commander Terrell most. He had spent 22 years in crisis diplomacy. He knew what anger sounded like when transmitted across official channels. He knew strain, contempt, desperation, triumph, wounded dignity, all the emotional weather systems that rolled through negotiations when real force sat underneath them. What came through from the human officer was none of those things. It was the voice of someone confirming docking priorities. Professional. Precise. Mildly inconvenienced, perhaps, but only in the way all duty was a mild inconvenience to the person performing it correctly. Directorate Crisis Vessel Harmonious Intent, she said, your status is acknowledged. Current operational zone remains restricted. You are requested to hold present coordinates pending completion of ongoing activity. Terrell looked up from the channel board to the bridge windows beyond, where the distant dark shape of the operational zone hung against the stars like a rearrangement in the structure of night. He had already been briefed on what had happened in broad terms. Earth fleet movement. Protectorate infrastructure losses. Multiple sectors under communications collapse. Assembly emergency sessions still in progress. Broad terms were not useful anymore. What is the timeline on completion? He asked. The human officer did not hesitate. I do not have authority to provide that estimate, Commander. I request direct communication with the responsible operational commander. I will pass the request forward. Her face remained composed inside the channel window. Mid-40s, maybe. Human age was hard to judge if one had not lived around humans long enough for the signs to become obvious. She looked like a person who had slept very little and found that insufficient reason to fail at her post. Terrell leaned toward his console. Commander, this vessel represents the Directorate under Compact Emergency Authority. I am here to issue a cease and desist order regarding active hostilities inside recognized assembly jurisdiction. You are required to acknowledge formal receipt. We acknowledge formal receipt, she said at once. Not defensive. Not sarcastic. Simply acknowledging. Terrell found that more destabilizing than refusal would have been. He sent the legal packet through transmission anyway. 17 articles cited. Emergency suspension language. Demand for immediate halt of offensive activity pending review and mediated settlement. The packet was received. Confirmed. Nothing changed. The human escorts remained beside the harmonious intent like punctuation marks. On the Resolute Vector, Commander Elias Vorn received the request for direct contact between casualty projections for Sector 4 and a revised detainee transfer estimate from Sequence 21. He read it, filed it, set it lower in queue than the casualty board. Not because the envoy did not matter. Because the planning already accounted for it. That was the thing about good planning. It removed the need to improvise moral weight into moments that had already been measured. The envoy's arrival had sat in the projections for years under several likely timings and 3 probable response profiles. First legal vessel. Second legal vessel with injured party representative. Emergency assembly presence. The counters were not hostile. They were administrative. Hold them outside the zone. Be polite. Confirm receipt. Continue. Vorn looked at the casualty board. 41 injured. 11 dead. He read each name once. Not because reading changed anything. Because failing to read would have been a lie about the scale of what was being spent. Then he picked up the comm and opened a short channel to the escort officer holding the harmonious intent. Commander Hale. Her answer came immediately. Sir. If the envoy repeats the request for terms, send back standard. Yes, sir. He closed the line and went back to the board. 3 hours later, Terrell asked again. This time he was not alone. The harmonious intent had been joined by 2 smaller Directorate legal craft and a Protectorate liaison vessel bearing Counselor Sel Vero's special representative, a woman named Reltesh whose face appeared on the channel with the tight stillness of someone trying to conduct diplomacy while standing on top of a controlled collapse. We request clarification of the conditions under which Earth will suspend current operations, she said. If there are terms, state them. If there are corrective steps the Protectorate can initiate, state them. Again the channel went to Commander Hale. Again her tone remained professional. I will pass that request forward. This time Terrell almost interrupted her. Stopped himself. Watched the channel close. He stared at the dead black where the human face had been. Do they understand the authority of this vessel? One of the Directorate legal officers asked quietly. Reltesh laughed once without humor. I suspect, she said, they understand it perfectly. The answer came back 11 minutes later. Not from Hale. From a text transmission stamped with operational authority and routed through escort command. 6 words. Read the last page. We are. The bridge of the harmonious intent went silent. Terrell read the transmission once. Then again. One of the legal officers looked up. The last page. Reltesh closed her eyes for a moment that was not long in objective time but contained enough exhaustion to age a face. Page 11, she said. Terrell did not know page 11. He had read summaries, briefing extractions, legal abstracts of the human statement. No one had thought it necessary to give an envoy the full filing because no one expected a filing to become operational reality before procedure caught up with it. Get me the full submission, he said. It came through from archived assembly record in under 2 minutes. He read page 11 standing on the bridge of a diplomatic vessel held in place outside an active war zone by 2 ships that had not once raised their voices at him. 73 entries. Coordinates. Categories. Sequence numbers. A date 4 years old. He finished reading and understood, all at once, why the human officer had sounded the way she did. Not contempt. Not confidence. Completion. There is a particular kind of calm that belongs to people no longer waiting to see whether they will be forced into something. It is the calm of those already inside it. Reltesh was reading over his shoulder by the time he reached the bottom of the page. She said nothing for several seconds. Then, very softly, they were never threatening us. Terrell looked at her. She kept her eyes on the screen. They were informing us, she said. Behind them, beyond the holding perimeter, the operational map updated again. Sequence 22 had just gone dark. By day 18, the Directorate had stopped asking Earth to explain itself and started asking what would make it stop. There is a difference. Explanations belong to rooms that still believe they are in control of the frame. They are for chambers, for committees, for species who think language remains the governing force because language has governed so many things before. Terms are different. Terms are what you ask for when you have realized that whatever is happening has moved below the level where procedure can interrupt it and into the older level where outcomes are built from position, leverage, endurance, and cost. Coordinator Nerol Thies sat through the emergency session and listened to the chamber try, in its own careful way, to catch up to a reality that had left it behind 3 weeks earlier. The room was full. All 52 seats occupied except Earth's. The small Earth seal on the back of the empty chair had gathered a thin skin of dust now, not enough to notice unless you had been looking at it every day, which Nerol had. Sel Vero sat in his usual place, no longer speaking as though he were managing a difficult but ultimately instructive species and no longer using the word proportional at all. The legal teams had moved beyond compact violations and into damage accounting, strategic reassessment, emergency framework provisions, all the machinery of a large institution trying to build a vocabulary sturdy enough to stand underneath what had already happened. It was good work. It was also late work. Nerol had a copy of page 11 open on his tablet again. He did not need it open. He knew the entries by heart now. But he had discovered over the last 18 days that looking directly at a thing prevented the mind from lying about its scale. Entry 1 had been the relay. Entry 8, the maintenance hub Demi 4. Entry 19, the buoy anchor installed over Carina Gate 9's dead coordinates. Entry 22, an outer fuel web node whose removal had cut 3 protectorate patrol sectors into isolated pieces that could still move but no longer in meaningful coordination. Now the sequence had reached 41. 41 of 73. The chamber did not know how to talk about that number without disguising it in law. Nerol understood why. Law was the instrument the Directorate possessed. When the only tool in reach is procedure, every event presents itself as something that ought to be processable. The problem was not that the chamber was wrong to use the tool it had. The problem was that the tool had already failed, and everyone in the room was still speaking as though its previous failure had no bearing on its present authority. He thought about the sentence he had written 3 days earlier and sent to 4 different committee heads. The more useful question is not what Earth violated. The more useful question is why Earth calculated 4 years in advance that the Directorate would not stop them from having to. 2 people had acknowledged receipt. 1 had thanked him for the clarity. No one had answered the question. Across the chamber, Sel Vero finally rose. He did not go to the main speaking podium. That mattered. The main podium belonged to statements meant for record. He chose the secondary response stand, which was where beings went when they intended something more difficult than performance. The Protectorate, he said, formally requests direct communication with Commander Elias Vorn for the purpose of negotiated cessation. Not ceasefire. Not mediation. Not review. Negotiated cessation. The room understood what the phrase meant and became very still. Nerol looked down at page 11 and thought, not for the first time, that Earth had built the most devastating part of this operation before the first fleet moved. Not the ships. Not the targeting logic. Not the casualty planning. The most devastating part was the fact that every species in this room now had to confront in public what it meant to have ignored a warning precise enough to become a sequence. He closed the page and opened a blank document. Title: Post-Action Structural Recommendations. He began to write. On the 19th day of the operation, Sergeant Jonah Mercer stood on the observation walkway of Sequence 44 and looked out at stars from the wrong side of the line. The platform was smaller than Demi, 4 had been, and more tightly packed, more signal spine than living space, the sort of installation built for function and never expected to matter emotionally to anyone who did not work there. His unit had taken it cleanly. 7 minutes. 1 fatality on the Protectorate side under active weapons discharge. 2 injuries in Mercer's own group, both stable. Efficient work. The kind of work briefing officers called solid. Mercer leaned one shoulder against the viewport frame and looked past the glass. Torres came up beside him after a minute with a data slate in one hand and a ration bar in the other. Secondary assignment just dropped, she said. He took the slate. Read it once. Handed it back. 45. 45, she said. There had been 89 in his initial transit bay. Now there were 43 still rotating directly under his command, the rest reassigned, injured, transferred into support chains or recovery queues. Smaller unit, smaller targets, the work narrowing as the list narrowed. That was how he held it in his mind now. Not all 73. Not all at once. The current number. The next corridor. The next door. The next room. You did not walk through something this large by carrying the whole of it in your hands at every moment. You took the next thing and made it enough. Torres studied him for a second. How are you doing? He almost said fine because fine was a useful lie and often a merciful one. Instead he said, 44. She waited. 44 down, he said. 29 left. Torres looked out through the viewport. That not what I asked. Mercer breathed out once. He thought about Carina Gate 7. About Carina Gate 12. About 379 names he had never known and 2 stations whose coordinates had become debris and signal loops. About the half-melted mug at 7's wreckage site, still sitting where someone had left it before the day stopped being ordinary. About the casualty board he had never seen but knew existed somewhere on Vorn's ship because armies worth belonging to counted their own dead properly. I'm doing the next thing, he said. Torres considered that. Then she nodded once. Yeah, she said. Me too. She left him there with the stars. On the Resolute vector, Commander Elias Vorn approved a route adjustment that would add 19 days to Sector 5's completion window and reduce projected fleet casualties by 11%. Lieutenant Mara Say brought him the recommendation just before evening cycle. It was a good recommendation. Not brilliant, not revolutionary, just good, which in military planning often mattered more. Good plans saved people in ways history never noticed because history preferred the dramatic. Good plans were load-bearing. They held because someone sober had done the arithmetic and chosen the slower route when the slower route cost fewer bodies. Mara laid the revised geometry across his desk display. If we preserve the original path, she said, we finish within the current projection. If we use this shift, we lose 19 days and gain 11% casualty reduction. Vorn read it, checked the assumptions, ran the medical chain impact in parallel, looked at the names already sitting in the board archive. Outside his office, the fleet continued its work with the patient pressure of something vast and disciplined and already in motion. Inside, the decision was smaller than that and harder. This was what command actually was most of the time. Not deciding whether to be ruthless. Deciding, in the middle of a ruthless thing already underway, how much of your own blood you were willing to save and what it would cost you elsewhere. The Directorate Envoy has now been holding for 18 days, Mara said carefully. Protectorate Command has sent 3 more requests for halt conditions. If we extend, the political pressure will climb. I know. She waited. Vorn looked once more at the casualty reduction column. Then at the days it would cost. Then back again. Approve the adjustment, he said. Mara's eyes moved just slightly. Not surprise. Recognition. 19 days is not worth 11%? She asked quietly. Vorn met her gaze. 19 days is less important than 11%, he said. She wrote it down. Not because she needed the instruction preserved. Because some sentences are not orders. Some are the shape of the structure underneath the orders, and when you hear one clearly it needs to be set somewhere outside yourself for a moment before you can continue carrying it inside. Vorn signed the route change. Sector 5 adjusted. The sequence recalculated. The operation stretched. He did not inform the Directorate. There was nothing useful in telling an institution that already believed itself entitled to interrupt a calculation why the calculation had just become longer in the service of preserving the people doing it. Late on day 22, Selvero's request for direct terms received an answer. Not through the envoy. Not through the assembly. Direct to Protectorate command channels, stamped with Earth Operational Authority. 6 words. When the last page is done. Selvero read the transmission in his private office and sat for a long time without moving. Outside his window, the station lights were cycling into artificial night. Below him or above him or in the direction that felt like one of those things, the stars held their places as though no chamber had ever existed and no species had ever imagined its procedures to be important enough to alter them. He thought about Miriam Vale at the podium reading her statement in that even voice. He thought about his own response, 22 minutes of language aimed at reducing force into process. He thought about page 11, which he had first treated as supporting material and now understood had been the truest part of the entire filing. He thought about the phrase he had once used. Charming. He would never use it again. By day 25, the operation had reached sequence 52. And across the Naxos region, every species that had once thought Earth's warning was a diplomatic performance had begun, finally, to understand the deeper truth of it. The warning had not been the beginning. The warning had been the last thing Earth said before continuing something it had already built. Sequence number 73 was not the largest target on the list. It was not the most militarily complex, not the most politically prestigious, not even the most expensive thing the Protectorate had built in the 40 light-year band around the old Naxos corridor. By any practical measure, there had been larger things earlier in the sequence. Relay trunks that connected half a region. Drydock rings that kept entire escort classes operational. Fuel matrices that let patrol wings remain on station long enough to matter. Those had gone first because the order had required them to go first. Sequence 73 was last for a different reason. It was the anchor point. The central transit arbitration hub at Vare Meridian, the place where all the corrected routes eventually passed through, where supply rerouting became policy and policy became habit and habit became the shape a region accepted as normal. It was where the first incursion had ended up in the records after the Directorate filed it as a navigational irregularity. That was what made the coordinates at the bottom of page 11 matter. The first point on the map that told Earth what the Directorate would do. The first closure. The first data point. The first proof that nothing would stop on its own. Commander Elias Vorn was on the bridge when 73 came up on the tactical display. Not because she needed to be there for the mechanics of it. The mechanics had been in the planning for 4 years and in the execution for 36 days, and the crew around her could have completed the final entry without her speaking a word. She was there because the last thing on a list carries a weight that the 72 before it give it, and some weights belong with the person who built them. Lieutenant Mara Say stood at the command table to her right, tired in the clear, disciplined way of people who have been running at full competence for too long and have not yet been given permission to feel what it cost. The tactical display showed Vare Meridian in layered detail. Traffic spines, docking control, route arbitration lattice, comm nodes, patrol support, civilian branches highlighted and then dimmed because the civilian branches were not on the list and had never been on the list and would not become the list now just because the final target was near them. The structure of the thing mattered. All the way through, it had mattered. Voss looked at the target. Looked at the civilian branches left untouched. Looked at the fleet positions, the angles, the timing windows, the redundancies that had held and the few that had broken and been repaired under pressure by people whose names she knew and would continue to know. Final confirmations, she said. The responses came back one by one. Strike geometry stable. Civilian corridors clear. Detention transfers complete. Medical retrieval screen in place. Withdrawal lane plotted. Target lock confirmed. She thought for one brief moment about the first date at the bottom of page 11. 3 days after the first incursion. 4 years ago. A quiet office. A fresh file. The understanding settling in not as rage, not as injury to pride, but as the colder thing underneath both. They will not stop. The process will process and the thing will continue because nothing in the process makes stopping more rational than continuing. And in that quiet office she had started a list, one entry at a time, because if the cost did not already exist it had to be built. Now the list had one number left. Execute, she said. Vare Meridian went dark at 0416 fleet time. Not spectacularly. There was no grand bloom in the void, no dramatic fireball fit for broadcasts, no satisfying image for news summaries or heroic memorial reels. Structures built to move information and traffic do not die cinematically. They fail in systems. Routing collapses. Docking authority vanishes. Power grids separate from their backups. Coordination goes from seamless to fragmented to gone. The lights on the tactical display simply changed state. Green to amber. Amber to gray. Sequence 73 updated. Complete. No one on the bridge cheered. The crew moved at once to the next thing because the next thing had always been what came after 73. Withdrawal sequence. Escort repositioning. Recovery pulse. Detention transfers. Damage assessment. The work after the work. The work that proves an operation was planned by adults rather than by people chasing the emotional reward of completion. Marase looked once at the display, at the small final change from 72 of 73 to 73 of 73. Then she looked at Voss. Done, she said. Voss held the screen in her eyes for one moment longer, not because she doubted it, not because she needed confirmation, but because there are moments you look at directly so you do not later remember them incorrectly. Then she said, begin withdrawal. Standard order. The fleet began to move. From the outside, the withdrawal looked very much like the arrival had looked. Structured. Deliberate. Not hurried because hurry implies unfinished fear and the thing was finished. Outer elements collapsed inward. Escort screens shifted. Retrieval units peeled back in sequence. Long-range groups turned toward home vectors with the same cold precision that had brought them across the line in the first place. It did not look like retreat because retreat is a shape made by necessity. This was departure. A leaving because the purpose had been met and staying past purpose would turn work into indulgence. The Sovereign Accord, which had been in holding pattern for 36 days, received the confirmation through the same professional and courteous human officer who had been answering it since the 4th day. Operation is concluded, he said. You are cleared to enter the former operational zone for assessment and detainee custody transfer at designated rendezvous. The envoy commander asked, all objectives complete? The pause. Not dramatic. Just a man checking a line in a system he already knew the answer to. Yes, Commander. All objectives complete. The assessment team spent 4 days inside the zone. Their report went to the Directorate under Emergency Classification, then almost immediately lost the practical protection of classification because too many species with too much rank needed to read it too quickly for secrecy to hold. The report was thorough and careful and written in the precise language of people who knew their wording would matter for years. It catalogued the affected targets. It catalogued what remained. Civilian infrastructure intact. Medical distribution intact. Educational and habitation sectors untouched. Food logistics untouched. Population centers untouched. Every target on the submitted list addressed. Nothing outside the submitted list engaged. The team lead used the phrase surgical precision in the first draft and then struck it out. Surgical was wrong because surgical suggested speed and elegance and the operation's defining quality had not been speed. It had been structure. The replacement phrase survived the final report because nothing better could be found. Structured selectivity. At the bottom of the report, beneath the technical assessment and damage maps and detainee accounting, the team lead added a note that had not been required but that everyone who read the report afterward remembered more clearly than some of the required sections. The operation appears to have existed in full as a completed concept prior to beginning as an action. In the Directorate chamber, the emergency review sessions ran long. Longer than usual, though usual had ceased to mean much in the 36 days since the fleet crossed the line. 52 delegations. Every seat occupied except Earth's. The little Earth seal on the empty chair still visible under the chamber light, the dust on it now thick enough that anyone could see it if they looked. The room was loud with law and quieter with understanding. Compact violations. Censure. Sanctions. Liability structures. Damage frameworks. Precedent. All of it necessary, all of it real, all of it the proper work of a body trying to turn unprecedented force back into something governance could hold. Counselor Cell Vero sat through the second day of the session and listened. He listened to the legal teams outline Earth's violations in excellent language. He listened to delegates from minor powers talk with visible fear about what it meant to live near a species that would spend 4 years preparing a response and 36 days executing it with no deviation from its own submitted list. He listened to senior assembly authorities discuss mechanisms for ensuring such actions could never occur again. He listened to all of it and found that his mind kept returning not to the legal findings, not to the losses, not even to the 6-word message he had received. Read the last page. We are. It kept returning to the date. 3 days after the first incursion. That was the lesson. Not that Earth possessed fleets the assembly had failed to model. Not that human military doctrine could be terrifyingly precise when sufficiently provoked. Those mattered, yes, but they were second-order truths. The first-order truth was simpler and harder. Earth had looked at the assembly's handling of the first thing and correctly inferred the handling of all the things after it. One data point had been enough. One closure. One filed irregularity. One calm return to process. Earth had seen the pattern in embryo and started building the answer before the chamber had accepted there was even a question. He understood that now in a way he had not understood it when he called Ambassador Vale's statement charming. He would never use that word again. Coordinator Nerol Thies spoke once during the post-action session. Only once. He waited until a recess window between formal agenda items, stepped to the informal comment podium, and said what he had spent 36 days trying to say in memos nobody read quickly enough. He said, "The useful lesson is not that Earth violated the compact. Earth did violate the compact. That is true and will be addressed. The useful lesson is that the date on page 11 tells us Earth made its calculation after the first incident, not the 11th. The useful question is why that first incident was sufficient for them to predict with confidence that this body would not stop the second, the third, or the rest." The chamber listened. Not because he had become important overnight. Because the question had become unavoidable. He looked around the room and added, "If we answer only what Earth did, and not what made Earth certain we would not prevent it from needing to, then we will have learned nothing except how to write a longer censure." Then he stepped back down. The session moved on because sessions always move on and because institutions do not transform in the moment a true sentence is spoken inside them. They transform, if they do, later, after enough people carry that sentence out of the room and find that it will not stop being true. Commander Elias Vorn submitted her after-action report 3 days out from Earth. 43 pages. The first 42 were what reports like that must be if they are worth filing. Timelines. Operational breakdowns. Casualty summaries. Tactical adjustments. Resource expenditures. Recovery notes. Recommendations. Clear, dry, exact. The kind of report planners use later when they need to do hard things with fewer errors than the last generation made. Page 43 was one paragraph. It gave new coordinates for the revised Naxos buffer zone. Not proposed coordinates. Not suggested. Not conditional on review. Coordinates. Exact to 3 decimal points. Drawn not by committee, not by diplomatic compromise, but by the geometry of what had happened. The diplomats would argue over them. They would write new framework language and debate compact articles and eventually call the result a negotiated agreement. All of that would be real in its own way. But the line itself already existed. The fleet had made it real. Below the coordinates, Voss wrote one final sentence. Earth has no further communication at this time. She read it twice. Filed it. Looked out at the stars. Then opened the first personnel assessment in the post-operation review queue and began reading, because the work after the work was still work and the people who had carried out the sequence were not abstractions that could be filed under success and forgotten. Sergeant Jonah Mercer got back to Earth on a Friday. He knew it was Friday because he had torn the right number of pages from the calendar in his bunk and because the new picture showed Marseille Harbor in afternoon light this time instead of dawn. He unpacked his kit at the orbital barracks outside Nairobi, laid out the fewer things he had returned with, and sat on the lower bunk for a while without doing anything useful at all. That felt strange. For 36 days usefulness had been immediate, always the next assignment, the next corridor, the next platform, the next thing to hold in both hands because the whole of it was too large to carry at once. Now there was nothing in his hands but stillness and a room with a plain ceiling and a stand-down period somebody in personnel had typed into a system as recovery allocation. He thought about Carina Gate 7. About Gate 12. About 379. About the half-melted mug documented in the Heliodor wreckage report because he had made sure it was documented and because some things deserved entry into the record even if the record could not contain enough of them to feel fair. He thought about 23 dead from Earth's own side. About the way the casualty board must have looked somewhere on Voss's ship, names changing state one by one. About Torres saying 44 down, 29 left. About saying I'm doing the next thing and finding that it had been true. He did not know if 73 done was enough. He knew enough was the wrong category. Enough implied equivalence. There was no equivalence for vanished stations or for names on casualty boards or for the way a process could fail slowly enough that someone patient decided to build math underneath it. Done was a different category. Done meant the list had ended. Done meant what came next would not be the same as what came before. Done meant carrying the cost instead of pretending it had been transformed by completion into something cleaner. He lay back on the bunk and looked at the ceiling. At Assembly Station, late in the station night cycle, Coordinator Neralthis finished the longest report of his career. It covered the first incursion, the closure, the second and third and all the rest, the warnings, the committees, the date on page 11, the sequence, the 36 days, the withdrawal, the new coordinates, and the central thing he now believed the Assembly had to understand if it wanted to go on pretending governance meant anything. The first thing matters. The first closure matters. The first dismissal matters. The first time a species brings a complaint in good faith and the process makes continuation cheaper than correction matters. He filed the report to the review committee, the legal drafting team, the interspecies oversight office, and 3 colleagues he trusted to read rather than skim. Then he sat at his desk in the low light with cold tea beside him and the directorate seal on the wall over his shoulder and thought about Earth's empty chair. Tomorrow there would be formal language inviting Earth back to the table. There would be new compact drafts, new frameworks, new procedural safeguards, better wording, more serious attention, real efforts, this time, to build something the date on page 11 had proved had not existed before. He believed in that work. He also understood something now that he had not understood 36 days ago. The table matters enormously when it works. When it does not work, the people who have been bringing things to it are still doing math somewhere else. He picked up the cold tea, drank it, turned off his desk light, and went home. Outside the station, the stars held their places. The old buffer zone was gone. The new one existed now in coordinates, in wreckage, in records, in memory, in the changed behavior of every species that had watched 36 days of patient arithmetic become reality. The assembly files held their statements. Earth held its dead. The dark held everything else. And somewhere between warning and answer, between page 11 and sequence 73, between the first ignored incursion and the final completed target, the galaxy had learned the part it should have learned years earlier. When a civilization warns you in calm detail, the warning is not always the beginning of the answer. Sometimes the warning is the last polite thing it says while the answer is already being built.